The story of last week's encounter between Russian President Vladimir Putin and U.S. President Donald Trump reflects on a smaller scale their closely scrutinized bilateral relationship and the caution they feel they must exert when approaching one another. Shortly before their brief dialogue at the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in Vietnam, Al-Monitor reported that the flurry of activity between the two countries at different levels indicated they were working on some joint decisions to be announced afterward. Hours before the two presidents were supposed to sit down for a through conversation, both Sputnik and the Associated Press reported a potential bilateral agreement was being brewed that would mention such issues as continued deconfliction between the U.S. and Russian forces operating in Syria and reviving peace talks in Geneva. Yet the meeting, which had been under preparation for a few weeks, if not months, and that Moscow clearly wanted, didn't take place. Trump was the only leader to skip the two plenary sessions on the first official day of the summit, raising speculation among the Russians about whether he was intentionally dodging Putin. Russian officials have been bewildered by this attitude, with Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov saying, there was no clarity over whether the meeting was going to take place, but, given the two presidents are in town, they'll meet one way or another. Visibly irritated, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov told a clingy Russian reporter to go ask Americans about the Putin-Trump meeting. Peskov added, we heard Trump's intent for the meeting, but I don't know what his pencil pushers ultimately told him. Later, a well-connected Kommersant reporter, Andrei Kolesnikov from Putin's press pool, referenced a source in the Russian delegation who argued the main reason the meeting didn't take place, even though it seemed to have been agreed upon, was the American sudden decision to change the location. We had an agreement that President Trump would come over to Putin's quarters in Da Nang, since at their last meeting at the G20 in Hamburg, Putin came over to Trump's place, Kolesnikov said, citing the source. But, according to the official, the Americans demanded at the last minute that Putin come to Trump's quarters at a time that was inconvenient for the Russian president. The Russians, according to the Kolesnikov source, attempted to reschedule the meeting for after the dinner so that it could go into the night if necessary, but the Americans allegedly insisted the only possible option for them was the time and place they indicated. The Russians eventually thought it was too impudent on the U.S. side and didn't respond, Kolesnikov said. What was immediately seen in Russia as a scandal and dubbed by the Russian liberal opposition as a slap in Putin's face was interpreted by pro-Kremlin commentators as a sign of Trump's own weakness to make independent decisions, weakness in the face of Russia opponents in his own camp. A quick chat and a brief handshake at the first-day photo shoot didn't count, as it couldn't produce anything substantial. So when, on the second day of the summit, Putin and Trump finally had a longer conversation while on their way to a final group photo shoot, it was a relief for all those in Moscow who feared the aborted meeting would have lingering political implications. Putin later downplayed the incident, saying the fledged meeting didn't happen because of the schedule differences and formalities of the protocol that our teams failed to manage. He quipped, they will be punished for this. What came out of the chat on the move made bigger news. Putin and Trump approved a joint statement on Syria. A Kremlin press release makes it clear the document had been drafted by the two countries' experts and coordinated by Lavrov and U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, and had been specially prepared for the Da Nang meeting. In other words, the Russians hoped the document would have a much bigger public and political effect, but the way the encounter happened degraded it somewhat. Substantially, though, the statement reaffirms each party's commitment to fight the Islamic State as until its total defeat, maintain communication channels to provide security for the Russian and American military in Syria, and prevent dangerous incidents between the forces fighting as. The two presidents expressed satisfaction with how the deconfliction has worked so far and agreed it helped significantly to raise the IS death toll in recent months. Commenting on the statement, Peskov told RIA Novosti that both Putin and Trump agreed that the conflict in Syria has no military solution and reiterated their commitment to Syria's sovereignty, independence, unity, territorial integrity and secularism in accordance with the UNSC Resolution 2254. Putin and Trump reiterated the significance of the de-escalation zones as a temporary measure to decrease violence in Syria, deliver on ceasefire commitments, improve unhindered humanitarian access and create conditions for an ultimate political settlement of the conflict, Peskov added. According to the document, the Amman Monitoring Center in Jordan, where Russian and American experts work together, will continue to monitor the ceasefire agreements in Syria. It's critical that Moscow and Washington also agreed that the final solution to the political settlement in Syria should be found within the Geneva process and in accordance with the UNSC Resolution 2254. Besides, the parties are sending messages to both the opposition and the government of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. The opposition is being urged to actively participate in the Geneva political process and support the efforts aimed at ensuring its success. Assad's government is encouraged to comply with the resolution, including constitutional reform and free and fair elections under the auspices of the UN and with the observance of the highest international standards, transparency and accountability, and with all Syrians, including members of diasporas, having rights to participate in the elections. This will now be an important reference point for Moscow and Washington, both in their bilateral contacts and in their communication with the respective warring parties. The opposition and the Assad regime are likely to disobey these principles, but they will serve as important guidelines. Most importantly, the statement is aimed at shifting the paradigm of Moscow and Assad versus Washington and the opposition to Moscow and Washington pressing for Assad and the opposition to work with one another. This is unlikely to work immediately, if ever, and is not going to change the public perception of who supports whom in the Syrian civil war. But it signals a principal intent in Moscow and Washington to leave their own conflicts of interest outside this specific equation and find a key to the 6-year Syrian deadlock by working together on the local players. It's hard to argue that Russia and the United States have found the long-pursued path to success, given that local players, Iran and Turkey in particular, have disengaged from the process. Other challenges include fundamental foreign policy differences between Russia and the United States, their record of Syria deals, and Washington's huge distrust of Putin. The joint statement, however, comes as a result of many months of consultations and coordination at the level of senior security personnel who are likely to have taken all of the above-mentioned factors into account. Thus, it's now the objective of Moscow and Washington to work these principles, each with their own domestic constituencies, regional partners and other critical stakeholders in the process, and to ensure to the best of their capability, that they don't derail it yet again.